We are in the last wind down of the day, but you're going to be on fire after this next presentation. Very cinema-centric. If you guys like deformers and morphing objects, you're in for a real treat. Hello, Internet. You see anyone in the Internet you want to say?
Hi, Internet. How's it going?
Hello, Internet. So we're going to get started here. I want to welcome back to the stage after several years, Sekani Solomon. Let's give him a big round of applause. Thank you.
Ooh.
Oh, you know what?
Thank you for that very, very warm.
In, right?
Oh, we're going to do a selfie.
Yeah, there it is.
Selfie number 2.
All right.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome, Matthias. Hi, everyone. My name is Sekani Solomon. I'm a principal designer at Cash, which is a business unit of Block. For those of you who don't know what Block is a finance and technology company that consists of Square, Cash Tidal, TBD, and Spiral. But also, this month marks 10 years since I presented at NAB, and I've been presenting with Maxon for about 10 years. So I want to give a special thank you and a special shout out to Maxon for giving me this platform and the ability to share my work with you all, because I really don't think my career would be what it is today without them. So a huge shout out for them. But also they make the software, so I literally could not make anything without the amazing tools that they make. Okay. I have a really cool presentation for you all today. I'm going to be showcasing some of the projects I've done at Block, including Reimagine and the TBD Explainer series. But before I jump into those, I'll play my demo reels for folks who are not familiar with some of the work I've done in the past. So I'll play that full screen for the immersive experience, and I'll let that go. All right. Thank you, everyone. Okay, I know this was my 2020 reel. I promise I will make a new one at some point. Okay, so the first project we're going to talk about is Reimagine. This project was a labor of love between myself, an amazing artist named Zachary Corzine, and sound and music was done by Echoic Audio. So before we jump in, let me actually play the film, and we're going to discuss how I made discuss some of the process, and then discuss how I made some of the shots. Let's pause, full screen, press play. All right, so let's exit that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit of process. So in my former role at Block, I used to co-lead our internal agency, Creative Studio. And when we launched the studio, we wanted to launch it in a memorable way that generates interest from both our internal partners and external collaborators. And we wanted this video to touch on what we aim to accomplish as a team while showcasing our technical and artistic abilities. So Zach and I were discussing, we were trying to figure out like what's the concept for this film. And as a team, we came up with this idea of reimagining. Reason being, as a team, we wanted to help our collaborators really rethink and reimagine what a design solution can be. A solution could be unconventional, it could be unexpected, but it could still be fun and bring clarity to a problem effortlessly. So for this film, we wanted to ground the narrative in that specific idea. So we ended up building a dazzling visual story that reimagines what spaces, processes, and conventional items could feel like. So this was the crux of our narrative. We start with something familiar, we start with familiar objects, we transform them into something that's more reimagined, something that's a little bit more interesting. So Zach was playing around with some really cool designs, playing with textures, playing with deforming objects, playing with cloth sims, with fur, all kinds of cool stuff. And I had this idea where I wanted to do something about recycling, changing like plastic bottles into something that felt more interesting, like glassware, something that you can repurpose for the home. And then Zach went out and built this amazing space. This is all textured in Cinema 4D and Redshift to really put the polish and the details and all the sexy nuances to make this look as photoreal as possible. So when we were at that part of the process, the next thing we want to do is start building out a narrative. So we started rendering out really rough versions of these shots. Let me just meet this. And this was really just to get a sense of like timing, pacing, how are some of these transitions going to feel like. And this really gave us a clear picture of how this thing is going to feel and flow. And again, I think I mentioned this in a prior talk. It's really important to start with very broad strokes before you dive into the process and start making like really, really nuanced adjustments to shots. All right, so I'll exit this. And it's interesting because things really change over time. Like this was a very early test of what that opening scene was going to look like, right? The logo was going to like burst through the screen, but we decided to take a more design-focused approach. But we really wanted the Block logo to feel like the catalyst that's going to start this whole transformation process. Okay, let me close that out. So we're going to be looking at two shots today. The first one being this bottle transformation shot. There's a ton of stuff happening in here. We have object morphs, we have rigid body dynamics on the covers that's exploding. We have cloth dynamics on these labels on the bottles. We have pyro sims, we have like animations everywhere. Kind of through the kitchen sink, we have caustics. But today we're going to focus specifically on the transformation of the bottles and then how we added some procedural details to the bottles themselves. All right, this is my favorite part, some Cinema 4D time. All right, so jumping into cinema, and here we have a basic setup of how we're accomplishing this, but let me actually turn this off and turn on this scene, and let's build this from scratch. So the first thing we're starting with is two profile splines, and for anyone that's made like a cylindrical object before, you're going to throw this in a lathe nibs. And usually that's what I would do, but because you want to build it and transform it, I'm actually going to use a mode spline. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to create a mode spline, we're going to drag that in our lathe nibs, then we're going to change the mode to spline, then we're going to go over to spline over here and drag our bottle spline in here. And voila, we have our bottle. So that was step one. But now how do we transform it? The answer is the spline effector. And I have to shout out Chris Phillips for teaching me this technique at Block a long time ago. I've used it on so many projects. So anyways, with the mode spline selected, we just want to make sure that spline effector is in there. And let's drag the spline effector into this null. And then we could take this glass spline and drag it into a spline effector, and that transforms the bottle to the glass. So how are we going to morph between the two? Well, you can move this strength parameter, but I think we want some more nuanced control. So what you can do is go into fields and create a linear field, and let's rotate that upwards 90 degrees, and then let's shrink this down like so. So now if I drag this up and down, we'll get some nice morphing. Let's actually turn this the opposite way. So as we move this up, we're getting this transformation of the glass. But the fall off here feels a little bit linear, like there's this hard ramp here. So let's actually change the mapping by changing our contour mode to curve and just making this a nice S fall off curve. Right here, here. Now we have some really nice fall off. Awesome. But if I turn this off and I look back to our original build, we're getting a more natural, unconventional shape. But typically when you're dealing with like a lathe NURBS, it's fully cylindrical. So how are we achieving this? So one of my favorite techniques, because I'm using it in a ton of other shots, is using the mesh deformer. So let's turn this off, turn this back on. Let's drag this linear field up. And the first thing we're going to do is make a new cube. And this is going to be our cage. So we're going to make sure and shrink this down. And we want to ensure that the entire glass is enclosed in this cube. And let's change our display mode to lines so you could take a really good look at this. Because if it doesn't, it's going to be really annoying. I'll just scale this up a tad for insurance. This is looking pretty good. Okay, so let's go back into our segments. I'm going to move this up to 50 because I want a ton of control here. Not 150, but 50. Okay, boom. I'm going to make this editable. I'm going to drag this into this null. I'm going to call this cage. Nice. I'm going to turn this back to quick shading. So now I'm going to go into a deformers tab. I'm going to select mesh. I'm going to drag it into a lathe NURBS. With the lathe NURBS selected, I'm going to go to objects. I'm going to grab this cage. I'm going to drag it into cages. Again, let me double check that nothing's sticking out. Perfect. I want to hit initialize. And what that does is that it's going to allow us to manipulate our glass by manipulating this outside cage. So if I go to mesh, if I go to brushes, let's make sure cage is selected. Mesh, brushes, grab. I can grab that cage, and now I can deform this glass real quick, which is nice, which is allowing me to get some really organic shapes. All right, now I can turn that off, just turn off the cage. So cool, one step ahead. But if I drag this linear field now, nothing is happening because that mesh deformer is overriding the spline. So how do we fix that? Well, this is why fields is also one of the best things, because we can just drag this linear field, put it in here, and that should fix our issues. Now we get some simple, nice transformation. And then I could just set up 2 keyframes on the y-axis. If I select this linear field, I could go to coordinates, y here, go to frame 36, animate it up. Select it here, and let me hit play. And I have that full transformation with just 2 keyframes. But now we want to add some more organic animation. One thing I love to use is the delay effector as a deformer. So if I drag a delay in here, I go to the deformer, I change it to points. I like to use spring first, and that's going to give me some nice little jiggle here. That makes it feel, again, like a little bit more expressive. And then I could double this up. I could then turn that to blend, and that's kind of giving me like a more natural expression of this transformation. Again, if I went back to the clip, when they land, it feels pretty expressive. It feels like it has some weight to it. And I love doing that with motion. So now if I go to the actual scene, I don't know why this bottle likes to disappear for absolutely no reason. If I turn this on and off, it's just going to reappear. But anyways, so you'll realize that we have some details on these bottles, and that's all being done in a procedural way. So if I open that geometry, I'm actually just using a displacer with like a custom striated texture that I built, or just did it in Photoshop, and I'm using a box feel, and now I can just kind of procedurally put that anywhere I want on my bottle, and then when it morphs and it transforms, I'm doing the same thing with another displacer because I need to add a different displacer for the transformed object. The last thing I'm doing here, just to give it like a little bit more of an expressive feel, a little bit of squash and stretch. So I just have a little squash and stretch here that's really exaggerating the motion downwards. Yeah, and that's just making it feel like a little bit more alive. Okay, so that was one shot. Now on to one of my favorite shots because of the amount of trickery that is involved in this. So I tried a bunch of things here. I tried volumes, I tried metaballs, I tried other things, and nothing worked. And I just remember the philosophy I used to use, like just try to figure out a very simple method that's going to convince the audience that the effect is real, even if it's not. And so let's hop into cinema and take a look at how I approach this step by step. Okay, so this is the scene. Inflates, boom, splits. And let's start off with this simulation at the beginning. Now, the timing of Maxon was amazing because right when I was working on this project, the new cloth simulation tools came out. So this actually was pretty easy. I just had a beanbag, I ensured that all the geo was closed, and I just put the overpressure to about 3 and dialed in an expansion time that I liked. Hit play, and that's not working because I need to turn this on. Okay. So I hit play, and then this is all simulated. So physics is doing all this nice work for me, and I'm like, I bet this looks good. When I have my simulations in a good place, I just bake it into an Alembic so I don't have to touch it. It's good to go. So I bake that into an Alembic. Let me just open up the version that has all the deformers on it. And now I can really modify it with deformers. So the next thing I did is add some keyframe animation to the shots with the bake Alembic. I moved it up a little bit, and then I just animated going back. But you know, how are we getting that splitting? That's the main question. Well, top level, I'm going to just enable all these deformers. It's actually 2 objects. So really, deformers are just making this squish, because when you think about something splitting, you get that tension in the middle. So I was like, well, if I could convince the audience that there's that tension in the middle and the edges are splitting, then I could just pop a whole different piece of geometry out of nowhere, and then, oh, suddenly it looks like it's splitting. And if you look at the final rendered shot, it's literally 1 frame in between the 2, but because the motion was designed in a very specific way, it sells the effect without having to do like some kind of crazy, you know, Houdini sim. And that's, you know, a good approach. So let me break this down, how we're doing this. So we're using a good old taper deformer. So the taper is squeezing down one side, but I had to cut off the effects with a field that's right here, because if I didn't cut it off, it's going to squish the entire piece of geo. So we have a taper on one side, and then we have a taper on the next side. And the taper just squeezing in, that's making it squish. And then when it's releasing, this taper over here just animating backwards. So it's giving it this nice tapered shape. And at the same time, this beanbag, this other beanbag is just popping on. So it's like, I was very proud of this. Very, very tricky. Anyways, so another thing that's happening here, we have a little shock wave that's coming through. And again, I like to add these nuanced touches to exaggerate the animation and make it feel a bit more expressive. And then when you combine that with a delay and a jiggle, it just really helps it to feel more natural. So I'll just play this back quickly. So you get that nice, animation at the end there. So then there's another thing I realized at the end here. It felt a little bit static, and I wanted some more organic undulations on the geometry itself. So I baked this. I was like, I'm happy with this. I don't want to touch it. Let me bake it. I baked this into another piece of geometry. And I do a lot of baking. That's the one thing, with Cinema 4D, it's not procedural, but we'll work with it. But anyways, so to achieve this effect, I actually simulated another sphere with a cloth simulation on it. So really all that's doing, there's a sphere here with some cloth animation on the top that feels really organic. And I'm using that same technique I explained in the last scene where I'm using that mesh deformer to transport some of that animation onto this baked geo. So now when I play it, I'm getting that nice undulation, and I didn't have to add a sim or anything to that baked geometry. This is a good way of leveraging other assets to bring just some, more subtle touches to your geometry. And I'm essentially doing the same thing on this side. So you can tell, you could really see that undulation happening here. And that's giving us, that nice effect. Another thing I'll touch on really quickly is this dust spray that we're getting on the bottom. I'm not using particles at all. It's mostly done with MoGraph and dynamics. So, not the right now. Let's make this a little bit easier to see. Okay, so essentially, what I did, I made a torus, and I deleted a bunch of the geometry points. And I have pieces of geometry that's cloned onto these tubes. And then I have a plane effector that's literally just shooting him up in the sky on the y-axis, and then a little bit of animation on the z. Then after a certain point, when it reaches the maximum velocity, I'm just letting dynamics take over. And that's how we're getting that nice falling with gravity. And I'm also have a random effector that's giving it rotation here. So all this initial motion is MoGraph, and then I activate the dynamics, and it's just going to give you a nice physics-based animation without having to, do a particle. So you could do it with particles, you could do it like this, but to me, this just was like a faster method, and I could really control how the particles sprayed. So then there was a second part to the shot where we have the chair morphing from a sphere and kind of locking into place. And this is going to be a different type of morphing that we're going to be demonstrating. So again, we begin with these two orbs. We're seeing that very natural undulation that's being generated from that sphere with the cloth surface. But let's turn off the bottom part here. And let's kind of focus in on how we're getting that morphing going. So I'm going to turn off all these deformers. And I'm going to scroll through, and we're seeing that morphing, well, not happening because I turned off the deformers. But the first thing that we did, I modeled the shape I wanted it to transform into. And I had to model it from this sphere because using this method that I'm using, it needed to be the exact same number of polygons, else the effect isn't going to work. So I'm going to demonstrate exactly how that works. So let me copy this. This is the sphere. Ooh, let me undo that. Don't know why I did that. Let me turn this deformed displacer off. Turn this back on. Then I'll duplicate this geometry here. It is, let me just start it from the beginning And I don't know why it's actually morphing without the morph tags. Let me try going into this tag, going to edit, then copying it. That works. All right, let's turn this off. I'm going to delete this tag. I'm going to delete everything under here, so I'll show you how that morphing works. So the technique we're using is a pose morph tag and then a morph deformer. So if you right click, you go to rigging, you go to pose morph. I'm going to select points mode, and I'm going to drag this back deformed piece of geometry here. I'm going to hit yes. That's going to automatically transform it. Then I'm going to go to animate. And if I shuffle between the two, that's just going to morph the shapes into one another. But I want a little bit more control in this, and I can't use fields. So this is where that morph deformer comes in, and I could drag this under here. And now I can add fields to it. And super simple, now I have a ton of control. And this is nice, like once you have this tag selected, it just picks up the tag here in the pose morph, and now again you can add fields to it. And I could just drag and drop this morphing, which is nice. So this, is giving me a lot of control. Okay, so I'll delete this. Let's go back to the main one. So, okay, first things first, we have that mesh, giving it some nice undulation. Then we have that morph. And again, all I'm doing here, I need to set this back to animate. All that's happening here is that we have a linear feel that is moving through the shape and transforming it. But then there's another step. If I hit this displacer, we have some more like natural undulation that's being driven by this displacer that has a noise field on it, and this other field that I nested in this other linear field. So a lot of my work is just layering effects to make it feel more nuanced and more interesting. So that's giving it like a really organic leading edge. Like if I turn this off, it feels plain, but this makes it feel a little bit more organic, and then it transforms and gets into its resting place. Now you add some delays, some smoothing, and you're going to get a really nice, subtle, restful wobble at the end that makes it feel really clean. This is like the sweet sauce to throw on everything like this. Like you put that on it and it just makes it look, I don't know, a lot sweeter. Okay, so there's one other thing. You realize that this thing is bending, but if I open this up, this deformed geometry, it's straight. So I actually have to model it straight, and then I have just two bend deformers in here that I'm using to bend it, because when I try to morph it into the shape, it just looked terrible. So yeah, this was definitely the way to go. Okay, so that was Reimagined. Now it's time to move on to another project, the TBD Explainer series. Let's play that film, and I'll talk through a little bit about the process, and then we'll break down a few shots.
The time has come to leave the old world behind. A world with no control over where your personal data is stored, shared, or secured. Greetings and welcome to TBD. We're a team that believes in a decentralized future where you own your finances, data, and identity. So instead of centralized entities like large corporations owning and controlling access to your information, we're building tools to return ownership and control back to you. Imagine all the sites you browse and links you click on the internet. This data is stored on a company's server and is often sold to other companies who seek to track your behavior. In our version of the internet, you control and protect your data, identity, preferences, and more in your own personal data store. And we don't want to build this future alone. We invite the community to build alongside us to create the best solutions collaboratively via open source. We're excited for a new decentralized future. A future TBD.
All right. Thank you all. So this film was for one of our emerging business units, TBD, done by a very small team, maybe 5 or so. I led animation on this first film. Audio was done by Ant Food. They crushed it. So the goal of this project, and this film is one of 4 films that we did, but we wanted to define the business unit, TBD, the Web 5 platform that they're building, and its 3 main pillars of that Web 5 platform. So we created this narrative structure where we start off in a photorealistic world that's a little bit more dark and cryptic, and then we transition using some type of device. It could be CRT TV, it could be some of a device to this TBD space. And we start off with it being 2D, then that transitions into 3D, and then we exit that world into a real world that feels more bright and optimistic. So naturally, when we had that done, we did a bunch of storyboards to kind of figure out the narrative beats and how we're going to showcase some of the key things we wanted to. And we created style frames for almost all the shots so we would know what we're creating. So let's take a look at the shots we'll be breaking down today.
Finances, data.
So yeah, this is the first shot we're going to take a look at. Man, so many voxels in these projects. Essentially going to take a look at how we're building the voxels, how we're controlling them, and how we're adding color to the voxels, seeing that more or less most of them is just one object. Okay, so back to Cinema 4D. So this is our shot. It's typically quite heavy in the viewport. So I'll just kind of play this through. And let's talk about how we are achieving this. So layers were paramount in this project to just manage the scene. So I could just turn off all the matrices, and I could turn on this geo, turn this off, turn this back on. So everything is being driven by keyframed animation. So that's the foundation of what we're doing. So I got that into a really good place, and then it's time to transition this into voxels. So let me turn off all the geometry. And let me go to this matrix object, and I'll turn off all the effectors. So we could really walk through how we're approaching this. So all these voxels that we're seeing is being made by a matrix grid, and we're rendering it using proxies in Redshift. So at render time, it's super fast because it's no geometry besides the instancing we're using from Redshift. But how are we defining the actual shape of these voxels? So if I go into this plane effector, let me just delete the fields in here. So right, if I go back into this matrix and I click on the effector and I hit, let's turn on this plane, we realize that everything disappears because what this plane effector is doing is scaling everything down to 0. So we're essentially hiding voxels. And the key is figuring out what voxels we hide. So if I go into the Fields tab, I could drag the geometry of that box, which is the $ and the cube, and we already start to see something happening. The problem is, it's set to the wrong mode. We need to change this to volume. So when we hit volume, now we don't see anything because it's actually just hiding all the voxels inside of the matrix object. So we need to invert this so it shrinks everything to the outside, and that's how we're defining the shape. So that was step 1. But notice when I play this through, you're getting like some stepping and some banding here. We're actually doing this on purpose. What's really nice about this setup is that I could move this grid through the geometry and I could get some nice banding which helps it to feel more 8-bit. So as this is moving through, I'm actually animating the matrix object, so I'm getting like a little bit of banding before it comes to rest. And then I have a vibrate tag, so it's subtly kind of moving through the grid, which is giving us like these nice little pops here and there, which again, it's all about those little details to make it feel, nice. So then if I go back to this matrix, go back into the effectors, we're throwing some more stuff on top of it to make it feel even more robust. So first I added like a random effector where I'm randomizing the scale to make the voxels just feel a little bit more organic. Then there's a random effector with a noise field, so there's like a noise kind of running through this that animates. Then I'm subtly shrinking down all of our voxels, so there's a little bit of space in between. Then let's talk about color, because that is a whole process. Now, Chris Phillips, who's a creative director at Block, he created a really cool color system to this, which is way cooler than what I'm going to show right now, but I wanted to show like a fundamental, or more like a rudimentary way we could approach coloring these voxels. So, well, this is the thing, right? It's just one shape, it's one grid, so how are you coloring the different shapes? We're going to do that using a plane effector with the color mode set to fields. If you hop in our fields tab here, let me bring this down. Okay. Let's deselect everything. It's all like no color. But if I drag in our cube and I go to the color remap, I could set the color and I could pipe that through our redshift material. So I want these cubes to be yellow, and then I'm giving it a little bleed on the surface with another cube. Then I want our dollar sign to be purple, and that's reflected in our color map. And then I'm adding a shader field right on top, just to give the color a little bit of jitter, so it's not just, you know, the same color. And that's more or less the process I'm using to define colors for a lot of these shots. And you put that all together, and a lot of caching and a lot of, you know, a lot of work after, and you get some really nice shots. Okay, there's one other element that I want to show. And this is the reason that we always have to cache all these files, is because of the delay effector. So if we add the delay on here, and I press play, instead of that like popping, let me just change the strength here so it's a little bit more visible. So instead of that popping that we're used to getting, it's a little bit trickier to see. Like you're getting like these smaller voxels here, that's easing the animation a little bit. And that's what we're using the delay effector here, just to ease the scaling of these voxels so it feels a little bit more digital. And if I play this back, and you look closely, you can kind of see some of that small, let me just repeat this, you can kind of see that small voxels on here. Okay, let's move on to our last scene, the heaviest scene of them all. This big building shot with this tidal wave of voxels coming out, and then we're building up this building. I just want to keep this repeating. Okay, there's a couple of things I want to point out. There's this, number one, all these voxels are animating out, then there's like a wave that's coming behind it. And then we see this building that's building up with voxels as well. So let's take a look at how we're approaching this. Okay, so here's a scene. If I fly around, yes, it is voxel heaven. It's voxels everywhere. Let me turn off this building and we'll take a look at how we're approaching the ground plane, and then we'll take a look at how we're approaching the building. So again, everything is being driven from geometry. So if I hide this matrix, turn on the ground plane, we have a landscape that I am throwing into a volume, but that is also growing over time, which is helping to give that like growing animation of the voxels. How we are accomplishing this, we have a sphere with a displacer on it that is growing, and then when the landscape and the sphere intersect, then we're getting that growing animation. And that's what's driving that growth. And this cloner here is just like the staircase that you see in the middle. So if I turn back on our grid, I turn off the geometry. I mean, another thing you're going to see, actually let me turn off the matrix. With this displacer, we're just animating the landscape really subtly. And why we're doing that is, if you look at this shot, the landscape's actually moving. So if we move the geometry, we get like some of this subtle animation on the floor here. So automatically, once we're using geometry to define this grid, and I mean, if I turn off the ground definer and I enable this, it is yeah, pretty big. A lot of voxels in here. All right, let's re-enable this. The other thing that we're seeing as this is animating out is there's a little wave. I'll just give this a second to come to rest. and rotate. Yeah, this is very, okay, here we go. So if I go into a matrix and I scroll down into this ground plane and I turn this off, you're going to see that tidal wave come down. And essentially I'm just using a plane effector, not building, floor plane. I'm just using a plane effector that's pushing those voxels up, and a little bit of a random field to randomize how much each voxel is going up. And that's how we're getting that wave. All right, let's look at the building, because I am running out of time. So let's turn off all this stuff. For clarity, turn off, off, off. All right, let's take a look at the building. And let's take a look at the geometry first. So I'm going to turn on this geometry. It's going to look terrible. It's really squishy and eventually resolves. I'll explain why in a bit. But what's driving this, if I look back to the clip, you can see that like the building's kind of pushing in and then kind of coming up like this motion. I'm not sure if you can see my arms, but like that. So what's driving that is the keyframed animation of the building. If I scroll back here, the geometry is actually like locking into place. And that's driving, again, a chunk of that animation. So if I enable this and I enable my grid and I turn this off, one thing we're seeing is that it's like we're seeing that animation, but it's growing on. So how are we like achieving this kind of growth pattern here? So if I go up to building, I'm actually using another plane effector. Not that one, but this one. If I turn this on, there's a huge cube with another displacer. I'm not sure if you can tell, but I use displacers on everything. And this displacer has an animated noise texture, and anywhere that this big cube touches, it's going to scale down all the voxels to 0, essentially. So if I turn this off, that's what's giving me this really organic edge, and that's just animating upwards as the keyframe animation is going on. And then we have one final step. Remember this displacer I was talking about earlier in the geometry, where it was looking all funky? So if I re-enable this, and I hide this geo, what that is doing is making the voxels feel way more organic. Like if I turn this off, I was animating it, I was like, this feels way too clean. And you're going to see like a bunch of the textures and stuff pop around, but this feels really clean. If I turn this on, it feels way more organic, and I have to just move it. But then I have a field that's moving upwards, so then it cleans up as it does, and the leading edge always feels a little bit more organic as it's going upwards. So it's like organic, and then it feels like pretty tight towards the top. All right, there's one very last thing. There's like these floating little voxels that are kind of locking into place as well. That one also relatively simple. I just have a random effector. I'm talking about these guys that are popping in and out. So I have a random effector with a linear field and a shader field. So the shader field is really cranked down, so it's only affecting a little bit of voxels. And then I'm using a linear field to affect that as well. So if I drag that linear field up, it's going to just lock all the voxels into place. It's essentially just turning off that random effector. And yeah, that is how we're accomplishing the shot. Okay, I think that brings us to the end of this presentation. My name is Sekani Solomon. My website, Sekani Motion Design. Hit me up on Instagram at Sekani Solomon or on Twitter at Sekani_Solomon.com. And thank you all, really appreciate it.
That's amazing stuff there.
Oh.
That was amazing.
Thank
really
you.
fantastic stuff. The cloth that you used, the cloth technique,
Yeah.
for the plastic bottles that turned into the glass vases on the first piece.
Yeah.
That was amazing.
Thank you.
Just such a clever technique.
Yeah, again, I always try to find the path of least resistance, but make it look more complicated than it is.
Absolutely. You always show the client it's more complicated. Yep.
Exactly.
Do we have any questions for Sekani here? So one at the back over there. Hold on a second. I'll run over to you.
Yeah.
Please, could you explain the rationale for using the shape with the displacer rather than using fields?
So the question was, when you just said it. Yeah, that's a really good question. One, what's nice about using a shape is that I could define the height of it with a shader field, because like you can't really see where the noise pattern is in terms of like the height. With a piece of geometry, let me just bring that right back up. I know. All right. I know, okay. If it's in here, I'm not going to see it. If it's down here, I'm not. And with a shader field, to me, it's just visually a little bit harder to control. And I could also define the pattern. It really just comes to visibility and ease of control. I just like using geometry. I'm sure shader field could work as well, but yeah, for me, it's just the visibility.
Cool, excellent.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, go.
So specifically the section with the beanbag of your first project.
Yeah.
With this type of approach, how do you handle the texture in it? Since you can't use triplanar because it slips around and everything.
Yeah, that's
Could you say the question again?
Yeah, the question was, how did we texture the beanbag animation? Which is a good question.
So I'm sure you didn't UV unwrap it.
No. That would be an amazing use of AI. That's make better UV tools. Okay, let me re-enable. Let me just bring this up so I could talk through it really quick. So actually, even though this is deforming, the geometry itself isn't moving, right? Like the UVs are pretty much stuck. So I could use a triplanar and just stick it, and it's okay. And again, like the geometry count isn't changing at any point in time. So actually just use a triplanar on it, and that worked. One thing I actually forgot to mention, if we look at the spots, the texture is changing during this transition. It's going from this cloth texture to this kind of translucent, iridescent texture, and that is being done using a vertex map and a field. So yeah, fields for the win, fields all day, every day. That's my motto. Fields, yeah.
I've got a question for you, Sekani.
Shoot.
You know those style frames in the bit-by-bit piece?
Yeah.
That look very, very like the end treatment.
Yeah.
You go through multiple iterations with those with the client before you get them, or is that just like the amount of work you have to put in, where you've got the design in your minds, and then that's where you want to go with it?
That's a great question. So, well, you just use the microphone. Yeah, I actually iterate a decent amount. I just didn't show it in the presentation. So we did a bunch of different looks before we ended up with this combination. But once,
Okay.
But once we we would try on like a couple, like one scene or two scenes. And then when we're happy with the look, we're like, okay, let's apply it across the board.
Got it. All right. I was impressed that it was so close to the look of the end piece as well.
Yeah. I try to get the design frame. Like some of these changed, like the building was yellow here. We changed the color, but more or less we tried to get these style frames as close as possible to the final piece.
That's really cool. Really well done.
Thank you.
Any last question for Sekani? If not, why don't you bring up your contact details again, so you can see where to get hold of him online. So thank you so much.
No problem.
Amazing use of some tools together to that wizardry.
Oh.
Make the client think it's more complicated. I like that one.
Yeah, I mean, cinema is a pretty capable piece of software, so.
Yeah, we agree, absolutely, yes.
I mean, I'll just say this too, like, in my role, I need to work relatively fast, and I need a tool that can allow me to make really complex things pretty quickly and approach it like an artist.
Yep.
And cinema allows me to do that, so
Nice.
it's a win-win.
It's all about the iterations, yes,
Correct.
absolutely.
Correct.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Sekani.
Thank you.
And we'll be back in about 10 minutes for another amazing presentation by Sasha Vinogradova, and she's going to do amazing floral designs in cinema and with Redshift. But please hang around, and we'll see you very shortly.
All right. Thank you all. I'm also in the back for another hour if people just have questions.